For over 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa Shogunate ruled Japan with a firm, iron hand. Its reign, known for relative peace and order, also led to Japan's isolation from the outside world. But in 1868, everything changed. The Meiji Restoration would not only bring the end of the Tokugawa era, but transform Japan into a modern, industrialized nation. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated power after the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, laying the groundwork for the Tokugawa Shogunate, which would go on to rule Japan for over 250 years. This period, known as the Edo period, was marked by peace, stability, and strict social order. The samurai, once warriors engaged in constant battle, now found themselves administrators, while the peasants, artisans, and merchants flourished in an economy based on agriculture and trade. The Tokugawa Shogunate instituted a rigid class system, the samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. It also enforced a policy of strict isolation, the Sakoku policy, which prohibited foreign influence and limited Japan's contact with the outside world. The only foreign presence allowed in Japan were the Dutch, confined to the small island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay, and the Chinese. For over 200 years, the Japanese lived in relative isolation, with little to no influence from the rest of the world. While Japan remained closed off from the world, global events were rapidly changing the landscape of international relations. By the mid-19th century, Western powers, especially the United States and European nations, were beginning to push for trade with Japan, seeking access to its resources and strategic location in Asia. In 1853, the world knocked on Japan's door in the form of American Commodore Matthew Perry. With 4 steamships, the so-called Black Ships, Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. The arrival of Perry and his fleet sent shockwaves through the Tokugawa government, which had long maintained the Sakoku policy. The Tokugawa Shogunate, realizing the power of the Western nations and the potential for military conflict, had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Kanagawa, signed in 1854, opened 2 Japanese ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, to American trade and marked the beginning of Japan's slow but inevitable entry into the world stage. But Perry's visit also exposed the weaknesses of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Japan's once unified and powerful society was now vulnerable to external forces. The shogunate's failure to defend Japan's sovereignty led to widespread discontent, particularly among samurai and intellectuals who were pushing for reform. The 1850s and 1860s were a time of growing unrest in Japan. The shogunate's inability to defend Japan and its subsequent signing of unequal treaties with Western powers sparked outrage. Intellectuals and political activists, who identified as Sano Joy, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, began to challenge the legitimacy of the shogunate. This movement pushed for the restoration of imperial power and the expulsion of foreign influence. As pressure mounted, political factions formed around 2 competing visions for Japan's future: the shogunate, which wanted to maintain the status quo, and the anti-shogun forces, led by a coalition of samurai and intellectuals who rallied behind the emperor. This division led to the Boshin War, a civil war between the forces loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate and those who supported the restoration of imperial rule. In 1868, the imperial army led by the Emperor Meiji's supporters dealt a crushing blow to the shogunate's forces in the Battle of Toba Fushimi. With the fall of the Tokugawa's military might, the shogunate crumbled, and power shifted back to the emperor after centuries of military rule. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 was the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of a radical transformation for Japan. The emperor, who had been sidelined for over 2 centuries, was restored to power, and Japan embarked on a path of rapid modernization. But the Meiji Restoration wasn't just a political change. It was the start of a societal revolution that would reshape Japan in every aspect: governance, technology, and industry. Under the guidance of the Meiji government, Japan swiftly embraced Western ideas. The samurai class was abolished, and modern military and educational institutions were established. The country developed a constitution, modeled after Western nations, and its feudal system was replaced by a centralized government. This modernization wasn't just a mimicry of the West. Japan adapted and transformed foreign ideas into something uniquely Japanese. The rapid rise of industrialization was evident in the construction of railways, factories, and the rise of urban centers. Japan's embrace of technology, science, and commerce laid the groundwork for its emergence as a global power in the 20th century. The end of the Tokugawa Shogunate and the subsequent Meiji Restoration transformed Japan into a modernized nation with an aggressive foreign policy. The rapid modernization helped Japan to compete with the great powers of Europe and the United States. Within decades, Japan had emerged as an imperial force, beginning with its victory in the Russo-Japanese War and its expansion into Korea and Manchuria. The fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate is a pivotal moment in history, a turning point that allowed Japan to leap into the modern age. It marked the end of an era of isolation and feudalism, and the beginning of Japan's journey toward becoming a global superpower. Today, the legacy of the Meiji Restoration can be seen in every corner of Japan. A country that once stood in isolation now leads in innovation, technology, and global influence. From the peace and order of the Tokugawa Shogunate to the rapid transformation brought by the Meiji Restoration, Japan's story is one of resilience and adaptability. A small island nation that once resisted the outside world now plays a vital role in shaping it. To understand Japan's history is to understand the very nature of change itself.